Life changes in an instant. One moment you're fine, the next, someone else's negligence has turned everything upside down. And when that happens, you need fighters in your corner. NACE Law Group has been standing up for DC families for decades, taking on medical malpractice, wrongful death, and serious injury cases that others won't touch. While other firms rush to settle, NACE fights for maximum compensation. They know your family deserves justice, and they won't stop until you get it. If you or a loved one has been hurt by someone else's mistake, don't wait. Call NACE Law Group today. Visit nacelawgroup.com. That's NACE lawgroup.com.
Today on CityCast DC, Jamie Raskin is a congressman from Maryland, but he's also a DC native, and he's one of the district's great champions on the Hill. This month, he's the author of a bill to terminate Donald Trump's takeover of the police department. In a GOP Congress, passing that may be a bit of a stretch, but Raskin stopped by for an interesting talk about just how political figures like him can oppose the administration's unprecedented surge into hometown Washington. Today is Thursday, August 21st. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC's talking about. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Hey, I'm psyched to be with you, Mike.
So Congress is in recess right now, but there's going to be a lot on the plate when you all get back. And one of the things that I think you would like to see on the plate is this legislation you recently introduced to terminate Trump's takeover of MPD. What does the legislation say and do?
We're on our Jeffrey Epstein recess. We were allowed to leave a few days early as they tried to bury all the news about Trump refusing to release the Epstein files. But meantime, they declared a totally ineffectual and fraudulent emergency purporting to give Donald Trump the power to take over the DC Police Department. The first thing was he has no power even in a real emergency to take over the police department, because that's not what the Home Rule Charter says. What it says is that in the event of a federal emergency, the president can direct the mayor to make the Metropolitan Police Department forces available for the purposes of serving that particular emergency and confronting it, but not taking over the police department generally. That takes the ball at the 8-yard line and runs it down to the other end zone. That's ridiculous. And that's why I think the court was able to convince the Trump administration they'd have backed down on that, or they would lose the way they've lost on preliminary injunctions and TROs and more than 200 other cases. But in any event, they don't have the power to take over the police department. So they backed off on that already. That's part of what we wanted to do in our resolution. But also it says, regardless of what their particular remedy is, there's no emergency, or they haven't identified an emergency. I mean, Donald Trump has talked about graffiti. He's talked about the blight of homelessness. That's not a federal emergency. That's a local issue that the local authorities are working on. I'm sure the DC government, like every local government, would love to have federal resources and help. But far from helping, the Trump administration and the Republican Congress have stripped DC of $1 billion of locally raised revenue that they were going to be able to spend on law enforcement, criminal justice, public education in this year. So anyway, our joint resolution just states the obvious. There's no power to take over the police department, and there's no emergency which would justify such a thing that's been identified by the Trump administration.
So real world, I mean, at least my read of the lockstep Republican Congress, this is probably not going to pass. Is this largely symbolic, do you think?
Well, I don't know. There might be a handful of Republicans who are willing to join us. It would only take 3 or 4, depending on who's in the chamber that day. And there might be a handful of them who are really willing to stand by the idea of home rule and limited federal government power. But I concede the point that it seems as if the vast majority of Republicans are just following along like lemmings and doing whatever they're told by Donald Trump. And there are not many that have sympathy for Washington, D.C. So I would say it's probably more likely than not that we're not able to find the Republicans we need. But we always go out and try, because that is our motto during this period. We fight every battle. We don't let them get away with anything, and we don't want to take this lying down.
Trump has mentioned, I mean, this is going to be another moment of legislation. Trump's mentioned he wants to continue control of MPT past the 30-day limit. This would require an act of Congress. Can you game out the odds there? Do you foresee an approval? And I don't even know, is that subject to filibuster?
He has invoked this emergency. He needs to get congressional consent if he wanted to keep the emergency going. Of course, it's never been done before, but he could just try to invoke another emergency and keep invoking them, which seems like that totally contradicts the structure and the spirit of the Home Rule Act. You know, it's a little ambiguous where this goes. It's hard for me to believe that Donald Trump has the attention span to actually want to get anything done in DC. Of course, if you were really interested in the welfare of the people of Washington, you would listen to their elected officials. You would listen to the people of DC. And the first thing they're saying is, give us the $1 billion back that's been impounded by the Trump Congress. These people have, just for no reason at all, you can't even get anybody to explain it, held up $1 billion in locally raised revenue that the mayor was ready to spend on police salaries, criminal justice, public education, roads, and so on. And so DC's had to juggle a lot of funds around, but is still hundreds of millions of dollars short of what they wanted to be spending in this fiscal year. So why not start with that?
If you're an agreeable person, you get along with folks. I'm curious, the idea of the president of the United States bossing around a local police force, any local police force, and the idea of uniformed federal troops patrolling a big city, this is stuff that for a lot of Americans, whatever their politics, doesn't seem normal and may make some people uncomfortable. Do you get a sense that any of your Republican colleagues, even if they can't admit it publicly, are a little leery about what's going on here?
I mean, we always start with Representative Massey from Kentucky because he's a libertarian and a fairly consistent libertarian. And he's somebody who believes in local government. So we can start with him. There may be some other members of the House Oversight Committee on the Republican side who would be willing to join with us. After all, they were with Mayor Bowser about bringing back the Commanders Stadium. Now, there may have been other forces afoot there that made them, quote, pro-DC in bringing back the stadium. And who knows whether that falls apart. But look, all of it does expose the radical inadequacy of the district situation. DC needs its statehood, like 37 other states that were admitted by the original states and the enlarging union along the way, because there's just no political safety in such a vulnerable status. And the people who are kicking DC around, starting with Donald Trump and Speaker Mike Johnson, just have nothing to fear from DC, and they don't have anybody that they feel they've got to deal with.
I think it's different because these guys live here, at least some of the time, and that gives them a different sense of whether it's, maybe it means they should know better about the mall being a pretty safe place. But do you think that changes the dynamic here?
I think in some sense it makes it worse. A whole bunch of the Republicans don't live in the city. They live in the Capitol building in their offices. They think that's like some kind of armed camp because they're afraid of the city. They repeat every crime horror story. Of course, you could tell the exact same crime horror stories about their own districts and say people should never go there, or they shouldn't have the right to vote because a crime was committed within their jurisdiction. Trump has just absolute nightmare fantasies about Washington, D.C., and talks about the graffiti and the homeless tents and all of that. By the way, all of those are local and not federal issues, and yet still he wants to impress both the National Guard and the Metropolitan Police Department into his own personal service because he claims some kind of federal emergency crisis.
So that's the other thing about the legislation. Your legislation terminates his takeover of the Metropolitan Police Department. But increasingly, particularly since they did not succeed at ousting the DC police chief, the focus has shifted towards, there now seems to be sort of a rush of red states, including Mississippi and Louisiana, both of which are not known for their great public safety, where they're sending National Guard troops here. Is there anything your legislation does about that? And is there anything that anyone's legislation could do about that? Or for that matter, federal forces like ATF. I'm sure that when you all funded it in the annual appropriations, you were not thinking this is an urban police force.
Well, yeah. I mean, I think going forward, and it will probably take Democratic majorities to do so, but perhaps not, we should specify that whether we're talking about the FBI or the DEA or the Secret Service or any other federal police force, they are not to act as the national secret police at the beck and call of the president to go and do whatever bidding he seeks them to do, including local law enforcement duty. So we're getting like a complete collapse of all of the proper boundaries and categories. And that, of course, has been the compelling, paramount imperative for Donald Trump to try to bring all power under him, whether it's Congress's lawmaking power or the court's power of judicial review or the power of the states and the cities and localities to govern themselves. He doesn't accept it. He wants to wipe out all those boundaries.
Hey, remember that amazing little cafe you discovered last summer with the perfect latte and the crazy view? Or that sweet hiking spot your friend told you about but you can't remember the name? With Overlook Maps, special places never get lost again. You can create personal lists of places you've been and want to go. Build your must-visit list for your next vacation, your foodie favorites for date nights, or your weekend getaways when you need to escape. Share your favorite hidden gems with friends and family. Let them discover that incredible barbecue joint you found, or that scenic outlook that takes your breath away. Or keep your secret spots completely private. Planning a trip with friends? Create a shared list where everyone can add their ideas. Visiting a new city? Check out lists from locals who know the real gems, not just the tourist traps. And here's the best part. There will be no ads cluttering your lists. No one's selling your data to advertisers. Just your personal collection of amazing places organized exactly how you want them. Overlook Maps. Collect, organize, and share the places that matter to you. Download free at overlookmaps.com and check out overlookmaps.com/DC to see some of our lists and great spots on a map in your pocket. Your places, your way. You mentioned DC's weird constitutional status. It makes it a little easier to do some of this stuff in DC, although he's certainly talked about doing it in other cities. Do you think if the Democrats win the majority or the trifecta in coming years, they will actually try to do something about that constitutional status?
Well, I'll tell you, we already have in the prior two Congresses. The Democrats on the House side voted for DC statehood, which of course is to not promote the federal city to statehood, but to redraw the boundaries of the District of Columbia. So that becomes the White House, the Capitol, the federal buildings, and then everything outside of that, the residential areas, get ceded to the new state that is petitioned for admission to the Union. We passed that in the House of Representatives. I believe every Democrat voted for it, save perhaps for one. I don't think we got any Republican votes, but the Democrats understand that people need to have political equality, and that means statehood. And we've admitted 37 states in the past, even over all kinds of objections that this or that state was not contiguous to the United States, or it was too Catholic, or it was too Mormon, or it was too poor, or it used to be part of another state, or what have you. And all of those political style objections were overridden because of the constitutional imperative of making sure that everybody is actually equally represented and can defend themselves against the representatives from other places. And we see with what's going on right now in DC, how vulnerable you are if you don't have your own voting representation in the Senate and in the House of Representatives.
The last time we had you on the pod, you mentioned another possibility, at least temporarily, was retrocession to Maryland. Is that still a thing on the table?
My position is I will, as a champion of democracy and self-government, I will support whatever the people of DC want. I raised that just anticipating such an emergency as we're witnessing today, that people in DC really needed to talk about what their future is, and they should try to view people in Maryland and Virginia who've been very supportive as allies in their figuring it out.
There's also, I mean, the sort of national politics writ large for people who don't follow things too closely and don't live in the District of Columbia or feel an emotional tie to it. There are some people who are uncomfortable with the sight of federal checkpoints on citizens anywhere in the country. But there's also been some discourse, including from people who see themselves as centrist, that crime in D.C. really is a problem and we shouldn't downplay it. And it seems to accept that the emergency is on the level. I'm curious about your read of the politics. Is this fighting against this police takeover and the flooding of federal forces? Is that a losing issue for Democrats?
Look, crime is a problem everywhere. And we need a Congress that's actually engaged in the policy actions that are going to help. One of them is a universal violent criminal background check on all gun purchase. Brady law has been tremendously successful, but now there are all these loopholes, like people can get guns online. People can get guns at gun shows without going through a background check. People can engage in so-called private sales without a background check. And upwards of 90% of Americans favor closing these loopholes and having a universal violent felon background check. But we are blockaded by the same Republicans in Congress who are cheerleading the takeover of D.C. so National Guardsmen can hang around the Washington Monument and around Union Station. This is not a serious way of thinking about crime fighting, but there are lots of things that actually could be done to make our city safer. I understand that upwards of 80% of violent crimes in the District of Columbia involve a gun. And that's true around the country. So you're not going to be able to seriously deal with the problem of violent crime until you're seriously going to deal with the problem of gun violence, which the Republicans refuse to do. So they could start with that. They could start with restoring the hundreds of millions of dollars of Department of Justice grant funds that were slashed by DOGE that were going out to local police departments around the country, sheriff's offices, community safety organizations, domestic violence victims organizations, and so on. Somebody at DOGE just slashed the entire thing. Nobody has even acknowledged responsibility for it or taken credit for it. And the Republicans have just been completely mum about it. And we were raising hell about this back when, Elon Musk was still in town before he got run out of town. Well, meantime, they slashed hundreds of millions of dollars in these DOJ grants. How about restoring those?
So folks I talked to are really curious also about the power you think you can wield in the minority, particularly in the House minority. It's politics, it's optics, it's framing the discourse. Can you talk to me a little bit about how you're meeting the moment?
Well, I think that's right. Obviously, the House and the Senate are in different postures. When we're in the majority in the House, we really control the gavel and we can get stuff done. And we've seen that. Things like passing DC statehood, much tougher to do it on the Senate side. When the shoe's on the other foot and we're in the minority, then the Senate Democrats are in a stronger position, at least to block some of the most nightmarish proposals. And we don't have a filibuster on the House side. But there are other things that we can do and other parliamentary mechanisms that we've engaged in relating to quorum and relating to amendments and so on. And we're involved in all of that. But what we need to be doing is playing defense and offense at the same time. In other words, we need to be rebutting and repelling whatever we can coming from them. And as the lead Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, I've been very involved in organizing our troops on the Democratic side to be engaged in the litigation to stop all of the lawlessness. And we've filed a whole bunch of briefs on an amicus basis. We've brought our own lawsuits recently. We went in, my colleague Joe Neguse from Colorado is the lead plaintiff, but I'm a plaintiff too, against their new rules trying to stop us from going to visit ICE facilities without 7 days notice, just showing up and saying, I'm a member of Congress, I want to see what's going on here. And they're trying to impose this new 1 week rule. So we're fighting on every conceivable front to defend freedom and liberty, federal law, our budgetary powers, our powers over not just the purse, but our power to declare war, our power over tariffs. We've done briefs in those cases too. Tariffs have always been developed only by Congress. We've never had a president make up tariffs before unless it was under direct congressional authorization. Trump is talking about IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which doesn't mention tariffs, which has never been used before in that way. And the so-called emergency he's invoking in that case is something he says that has been going on for 40 or 50 years. It doesn't sound like much of an emergency.
So one thing that has struck me, and, I grew up in Washington, as I know you did. This is a city where we've had massive protests of millions of people flooding the mall. There has been very little by way of a big organized protest in Washington since the law enforcement takeover was announced. And I think in Kiev, when Zelensky did something people thought was undemocratic, 200,000 people went out in the streets in the middle of a war. Why do you think there is such a tepid sort of human beings in the street response so far?
Well, that's easy. That's not by chance. That is a very careful and shrewd strategic choice by the movement. Take the No Kings rallies, right? Now, on that day, Donald Trump had decided to conduct his military extravaganza choreographed throughout the day. He would have loved nothing more than if Indivisible had said, okay, everybody converge on Washington. So say 1 million people show up there. Remember, Donald Trump has pardoned his private militia of 3%ers, Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, Ku Klux Klansmen, you name it. And those people would have loved nothing more than to go and say, there's Antifa, and then to start a whole bunch of street fights. At that point, Donald Trump gets to impose martial law, and he's off to the races. That's what he's looking for. Instead, Indivisible said, we're going to have protests and rallies all across America. It ended up being in more than 2,000 cities and towns, the largest protests in the history of the United States. I think it was more than 5, even perhaps more than 6 million people who participated, and it totally dwarfed what Donald Trump had going on in Washington. And we didn't fall for that trap. It's not for a lack of street action, Michael. It's all over the country.
Have you been asked yourself, as a leader, as a celebrity within the Democratic firmament, to speak at rallies or join protests about this specific issue in D.C.?
Not that I'm aware of, but I would be very psyched to be part of that. I mean, I went to protest when this nightmare first began at NOAA and at AID, and I said, a rally a day keeps the fascists away, and we've got to be in the streets. And they're organized overnight. They get 500, 800,000 people. That's different than 1 million people, and those take some buildup. But Indivisible and the other nationwide groups are doing it, but they're spreading it around the country. And I think a much smarter way to proceed. But on the No Kings Day, they asked me to go up to Philadelphia, which I guess was supposed to be the flagship rally just because of Constitution Hall and everything. And there were around 100,000 people there. It was very impressive and moving. And when I got there, I just said, look, we're never going to be founding fathers in the 18th century, but we are all going to be founding fighters in the 21st century. We are fighting for the defense and the transformation of democracy.
Congressman, thank you so much for being here.
Totally my pleasure. Thanks for having me, Michael. Keep up the great work.
Okay, that's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not send it to a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. And become a neighbor. Your support is more important than ever. Head to membership.citycast.fm to support our work and get a little bit closer to the city you love. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.